The trail is a metaphor for change. Although hiking, and specifically endurance hiking, is now a big part of my day-to-day, it's not just about exercise. It's about transformation. Each step is a movement towards clarity, purpose, and identity. But movement is one thing, sharing insights gained is another. As a U.S. Marine veteran, I created this space to help other veterans gain clarity, purpose, and identity. Let's walk this path together. This is Trail to Transformation.
Most people aren't broken, they're just dysregulated. Chronic stress, pain, anxiety, and burnout aren't mindset failures. They're nervous systems stuck in survival. I'm Leland Holgate, combat veteran and neuroscientist, and I created the Welcome Home method to help people rewire their nervous systems with breath. To go deeper, visit thewillfulwarrior.com.
Hey, welcome back, everybody. Of course, you know me, Dr. Keith McNally. I am here with Dr. Summer Watson, and it's so cool. And the reason this is going to be a really special episode on Trail to Transformation is because I'm a Marine, but Dr. Watson, you're married to a Marine.
I am. So thank you for your service, Dr. McNally.
Well, thank you for supporting those who are in service. So before we get into a deep dive into the conversation, you're a doctor, but give us some background as to who you are professionally, and then we're going to talk about what it means to be the wife of a Marine.
Oh, okay. Thank you for asking. So my name is Dr. Summer Watson. I was not born a doctor. We had to earn that, right? So, I was raised by a single mom in California and essentially went off to college, did that thing. I went to Berkeley. I loved it. And at that point, I learned how to really create communities, systems of support. Once I got out of Berkeley, I took about a little while, a few years, to decide that I want to get married. And after 7 years of dating my boyfriend, my high school sweetheart, we ended up getting married. And he was the one who joined the Marine Corps, and we had a 21-year life as an active duty Marine family. And during that time, I got my master's in human services with a specialty in community counseling, which helped me work in nonprofit, with local government, and building out communities and helping support large grants. I also worked in schools, K through 12, in support of students, sitting on an IEPs, SSTs, helping reduce recidivism of folks that are young folks that, had already been to juvenile hall. So there were a lot of things going into communities and doing communication groups and all these different things, which were wonderful. And then when I had received my master's degree, I started working in the clinical field of psychology and assessing people who were homicidal, suicidal, and gravely disabled for 3 years for Sacramento County in California, and then worked for different hospitals, ran different departments, got my doctorate in clinical psych, and then started my own business called Core Women. And so that's what I do today. And so I do leadership development under that business. I run a virtual assistant group under that business. And then I also just launched the Human Forward movement. So, and thank you for posting my website.
Well, I appreciate all that information, and we're going to have to come back at another time and maybe talk about all of those things, specifically about building community, because that's core and essential, I think, to any level of success that we are as human beings. You weren't born a doctor, but you also weren't born married to a Marine either. That takes some guts. Joining the Corps in and itself takes guts, but marrying somebody who's in the Corps takes guts. Can we start the conversation there? Like, what actually navigated that? Yeah, high school sweethearts, yeah, but still, what are you marrying into, or did you know it?
Okay, so I didn't know it. I had dated a couple of military guys before I started dating my husband in high school, and that was a different situation. Dating and being married into it was different. It looked different, felt different, and you thought you could handle it. It's just a microculture that I just wasn't familiar with in regards to being a spouse to a Marine. And when my husband joined, he joined at a later time in life. Like he joined at 24. And I saw that as later because most of the people we were around at that time who had enlisted, and my husband was enlisted at the time, he was 24. And so the people around us were 18, 19, 20. And so, I felt like we are a little older. I had lived a lifetime already, it seemed like, from undergrad to going off and traveling across the country in my car and driving from California to Connecticut when I got into law school and I had lived that life, right? And so when we got into the military, or I say we because we're family, right? A military family. Um, it felt different. It felt like I was constricted a bit, right? So we were known by our ID cards. Yes, we lived on a base, so there were certain do's and don'ts. Of course, like everywhere else, in regards to following, the rules. But there were also certain expectations of military spouses, of how we were. Perceived, the things that were expected of us in relation to going through certain classes, uh, so that would have a better understanding of the culture. Also, having to go to balls, Marine Corps balls, different dinners, what that cost us, being enlisted, because at the time that my husband was, he didn't make very much money, right? Not much money at all. And I definitely made more money when we weren't enlisted and I was going to college and I was working full time, and so you know and that also impacted my opportunity for jobs, right? So what I could look for, where we landed every time we got orders to a new duty station. So there were just so many things. And no, I was not born a military spouse either, and I had to learn how to be a military spouse and what that looked like for me, right? So,
Hmm. So, kind of just to give our audience some perspective, enlisted, you have to live on base. Now, typically, the enlisted, the 18, 19, 20-year old, we're all living in barracks. I lived in a barracks. I was in
right.
Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. Um, what's the living situation? Because your husband goes in as a, goes to boot camp.
Yes.
E1, E2, E3, one, you're not making a whole lot of money. Not even considered a non-commissioned officer yet, an NCO. So life on the whole is challenging. So can you talk about that just a little bit? What those
For certain.
first couple of years were like, living on base, being married, and having to support your husband.
Oh my gosh. Wow. That's a
Well,
lot.
okay, break it down into some simple ideas.
Okay, okay, simple ideas. All right. So we move in, and this question really harkens back to a feeling, right? Because when I was in college, I had my own apartment. I was a sorority president, so I had my own room in my sorority. So when we went and we were offered housing as a married couple, we were offered a 500 square foot place
Hmm.
that essentially we walked into, and my husband looks at me because I'm about ready to start crying. It's in the middle of the base on Camp Pendleton, and it's one room, and it's got a little kitchen, it's got a little sitting area, it's got a stairway that goes upstairs that's open, and it's a loft essentially, and a bathroom upstairs. And I was like, this is where we're living. And he's like, he just looked at me, and he basically didn't say in his words that I don't want to hear this, but his face was, please don't. Please don't say anything.
Hmm.
And I was just like, oh my God, it's in the middle of base. It's extremely hot. It's a place in the middle of this of multiple apartments essentially, and the two on the outside were two bedrooms, and they had like a front door and a back door. Ours was smack in the middle. It didn't have crosswind, breeze for a wind. It had one window, one sliding. It was so small, and that was difficult. Just that adjustment alone, having and bringing my stuff, his stuff, into a space like that. Did we make it work? We made it work. The second part of that was a job. So at that point, I think we had one car. And because we were really trying to reduce with his amount of pay, we were trying to reduce bills, we were trying to pay off bills, we were trying to do all this stuff so we could manage with that one car, essentially. And so we lived in that space, and I got up, I would take him to work, I would get ready for my job, I would go to my job because he had to be at work at like something insane, like 6 or something, right? And he worked 24 on, 24 off shifts because he worked in the brig, and he was what not an MP, but security. And so anyway, so with that said, I knew that I had to get off of work, that I needed to race home, get him, or pick him up the next day early in the morning, depending on his shift. And so, yeah, that was tough too, because, that interfered with sleep, that interfered with the jobs that I could get, because we were 10 miles outside of the gates, right? Essentially out of the front gate, and then about 4 or 5 miles outside of the back gate. So, maybe 3. And so, yeah, so just finding a job that I liked, that aligned with my values and my system and what I was looking for, and then being able to do that job by managing the house, managing our budget, managing, picking them up and dropping them off. So those are some of the nuances to my experience with just starting out as somebody who had already had a life and then had to learn about the subculture. And so some of the other things that were very interesting, Dr. McNally, were the communication, right? It was the communication. It was the, what was the other factors? The authoritarian military lifestyle, right? So what they dictated of our husband, and then what that resulted in for the family, right? For me, like, so their working hours, if they needed to go somewhere, when they would get information, how would my spouse relay that information? Did he relay that information? Did he forget to relay that information? So those were the things that would cause havoc in our household. Like, didn't you tell me? Or, oh my gosh, you just found out and they want you to do A, B, and C. So yeah, so that was a shift for sure.
Because I want everybody who's experienced this conversation when it airs, I want them to feel good about this situation.
Yeah.
Talk to me about words like sacrifice, commitment, staying with it, all of those things that are going to make this marriage and career a success.
Okay. And those are all great questions. So sacrifice. We do make sacrifices. We make sacrifices. Military, the individual makes a sacrifice. They make a sacrifice, but they also do it. And this is what I've noticed, at least in my husband. My husband was not looking for accolades, was not looking for thank yous. He did it to serve his country. He did it because this aligned with his own values. And this is where he wanted to be. And so he wasn't looking for anything else but to learn his job and to be able to support our country and his community of Marines, right? And I think that was part of, I don't know if it was a sacrifice for him. It was, that's the life. That's the life I chose. So there was nothing about it that he said, oh gosh, I don't want to do this. I hate doing it. Nothing like that. And my husband, you never heard a complaint. My husband was the kind of person where we grew up, he never missed a day of high school. Not once. No matter if he was sick or if he broke a bone or whatever. It just wasn't him. So he just didn't have a lot of complaints. And so, I don't know if, it would be considered a sacrifice. The sacrifice came, I think, when we moved from place to place so often, right? And he knew he knew that as a military spouse that I would need to sacrifice certain things. My vision was for myself growing up, being raised by a single mom who was very independent, raised me very independently. She said, you know, you can really be anything you want. And so the movies, and I'm going to date myself here, that I grew up on was like Working Girl, Baby Boom. And so I envisioned myself being with a company, getting tenure somewhere, having that office with a window, staying with that company. And when you marry somebody in the military, that just doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. So, erase that. And that's not easy to do. So it actually took me, and I'll be really honest with you, Dr. McNally, it took me about 10 years to get past that.
Well, 10 years, that's a time reference because something happens. He's no longer enlisted. You experienced life as a spouse, both from married to an enlisted spouse and an officer spouse. Same person. Let's kind of get that.
Same person.
Same person. We talked about culture and community.
Yeah.
Does the culture and community shift from being enlisted to being in the officer community? Or what does that look like from your perspective? And you laugh.
I do laugh because, from a clinical perspective, you are married to somebody who has a distinct personality, right? And that personality doesn't really shift. So a lot of it is incumbent on your spouse. You rely on them for information, communication. You rely on them to, be part of the familial system, right? And what does that look like for them? And that can look different for each military family member or system or family, right? And so I think the way that we set it up was okay. And I got more clear as the years went on, like, hey, when you have something reported to you that you can report to me, let me know as soon as you can. Because that's what's going to interfere with our relationship is when there's a bunch of unknowns out there, yet you've heard about this and you've known about this, and I can't do anything until I know. I can't help you, right? I can't help whether or not you need to be somewhere or I need to adjust my schedule, or those are the things that will interfere with a marriage. I did a study on this, right? So the effects of war on military marriages. So I actually did my doctoral study on this. So there are certain things that will definitely impact a marriage, but what impacted mine was the lack of communication, right? Or that authoritarian military culture where you did sacrifice certain things. Or here's the thing, and I will say this, once I learned how to maneuver within that system, then it was a click. It wasn't that he went from enlisted to officer. It was that something in my brain clicked. And I said, if we've been in this 10 years, then one, you're a smart guy. Get your degree, right? Because he could have gotten his degree. I mean, my husband was so incredibly intelligent. Like when we graduated from high school, he graduated with math honors. He had already been through AP math. He was going to college for AP math while we were in high school, like extensive math for beyond AP math, right? He was extremely he had it. He had it in so much so in regards to his knowledge base and what he could retain that I said, knowledge retainment came easier for him than it did for me. And I said, why don't you use this? Why don't you go and get your degree while you're in? But see, the problem was he was working 24 on, 24 off, 24 on, 24 off. So on the days that he was off, he was needing to sleep. He was needing to do some things that we needed him to do around the house potentially, and I needed his support, right? We were married. So there's where the sacrifice comes in those little bits of, of how we related to each other, how we connected with each other. But at the same time, when we did connect with each other, it made us stronger. It made us sustainable. It made us committed to the lifestyle.
So let's talk about what you said. It was this epiphany moment. The light came on.
Mm-hmm.
You figured it out.
I figured it out.
What was it that you figured out? Because everybody else wants to know. Every spouse who's married to a military individual needs to know. And it could go both ways. If there's a woman married to a male,
sure,
enlisted officer, or the other way around,
yeah.
What did you figure out? How does this become successful? How did you make this successful?
Okay, so great question. So it wasn't about, yes, The overarching issue was we're a military couple, right? What I figured out was, hey, Summer, if you're asking your husband at that 10-year mark, it wasn't because he was enlisted or officer. At that 10-year mark, I had the conversations with him about, hey, if you're going to stay in this, because at that 10 mark, you do have those conversations. I hear it from all different military couples and spouses. Like, are we going to move forward past the 10-year mark? Are we going to get out? Right. And so at that 10-year mark, we were having that conversation, and we had the conversation like, okay, are we going to stay and get out? And I said, well, it's been good to us so far. However, here are some of the things that, I would like to see different. And that's, our communication had grown. It had gotten better. It had gotten stronger. But at the same time, what I mean by figuring it out, it was my own mind shift. And so that mind shift was, all right, we're staying in. We have a plan. I'm a planner. So if we have a plan and we know that we're staying in, then what does it mean? What does that look like 10 years later? So 5 years later. And so I said, well, I think here's my idea. It would behoove you to get that degree and start working on that degree. And possibly then at that, once you get that degree, then go for an officer billet. And that's what he did. I said, because you want to utilize this resource that you have, the military, for what it's got to give you. And then at the end, we can reflect back and go, okay, you worked this 21 years and here's how it's giving back, right? Because you do that sacrifice, and the sacrifices are those little things, that marriage, those sacrifices within your marriage, not being home, being away for training, being away for a year while he was at war, transferring and leaving all your resources and your family to go overseas for 3 years, right? So these are big things, and these are big deals, especially for professional women.
We've got a couple minutes left,
Mm-hmm.
and I want to hit on two specific points real quick. And then I'm going to ask you if you could come back, because we're going to talk about some other things that you've done professionally that could impact the lives of military families. But my first thought was, you made marriage important. As a matter of fact, you and your husband made marriage important, despite you had two very different objectives in terms of your career. I'm going to say it again. You made your marriage important. Can you talk to me about that in a couple minutes?
Yes, absolutely. We did. We made it a priority. My husband, I have to give him kudos. He is committed. And, he was working within the military structure, and he is working with a very independent, hard-headed woman. And so, and so with that said, he's been working with two tough systems, and yet I was able, and he was able, we were able to meet in the middle and say, okay, if we're going to stay in this is how it's going to work. And we came up with our own system. And so he left work at work. And when he came home, he was just who he was. And I love that about him, that he could do that. And that was good for our marriage, right? Because we needed each other independent of the system that we were working within. So, yeah.
I so appreciate that answer. So my second question is, you did some studies on how war impacts
Yeah, the
families.
effects of war on military marriages.
So we got about 2 minutes, maybe two and a half. Can we hint to that? Because again, I want to bring you back and dive deep into that particular conversation if you're so willing. But for right now, can you talk about that?
Yeah, just briefly, I looked at several different factors: authoritarian military structure, frequent deployments, ages of spouses, culture, financial concerns, communication between the spouses. So I looked at those particular variables and how that influenced those marriages within that system. And so it goes deeper. It was a qualitative study, so I used phenomenology, which was really devised by Edmund Husserl. And so, again, phenomenology is just a word for somebody's subjective lived experience. So, with that, I'll leave it there.
That's a perfect place to leave it. And so I do want to thank you for joining me in this conversation. I totally appreciated it. I do want to invite you back, if you're so willing, to dive deeper into what you just talked about, especially that word that I don't think I can pronounce. But until then, as I always say, I'll see you on the trail. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching Tread to Transformation TV. To support these conversations or to support the foundation, I would ask that you go to givebutter.com/T3missionorg. That's the letter T, the number 3, MISSIONORG. Or go directly to our website at t3mission.org and click the donate button. Or just scan the QR code as you see it on the screen. And as always, I will see you on the trail.